President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to address the Senate at the morning hour.
Without objection.
Mr. President, thank you very much. This afternoon, the President will be signing an executive order to increase accountability within the Department of Veterans Affairs. For several years, I've been calling on the VA to hold bad actors within the VA accountable, and in my view, in too many instances, that has not occurred. There are far, far too many examples of those who commit wrongdoing while working at the VA, and even crimes against veterans and other VA employees have occurred without any consequence. On the first day in office, I wrote the President urging him to make accountability within the Department of Veterans Affairs one of his top priorities. We see too many examples, and unfortunately, one of those egregious examples is in my home state of Kansas, where we face a terrible example of a VA employee violating the trust of veterans. Yet the VA seems to have no real sense of urgency in holding this person accountable or committing to fix the process by which he got into the position that he could commit the acts that he did. In 2015, we learned from local newspaper reports, not from the VA, that a physician assistant at the Leavenworth VA hospital had been sexually abusing veterans. Shortly after that news broke, Leavenworth County prosecutors charged this individual with multiple counts of sexual assault and abuse against numerous veterans. He is currently awaiting trial. The stories continue to come into our office and to the prosecutor of other victims, veterans who sought services at the VA, the place they would expect to be cared for, respected, and the place they would certainly should find safe. They found something exactly the opposite. As the story unfolded, we learned that Mr. Wisner, the person now charged with crimes, targeted vulnerable veterans suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. He prescribed opioids that inhibited their thinking, and he used his position to deepen their wounds of war rather than to heal them. Although Mr. Wisner is now beyond the reach of the VA, he and others like him who fail our veterans are not beyond the reach of Congress. It's ridiculous that taxpayers continue to fund pensions of VA senior executives and personnel convicted of crimes that harmed our nation's veterans when they should have been serving and caring for them. In the last Congress, we led significant efforts to develop and introduce and to pass legislation. Most of those efforts were with the senator from Connecticut, Senator Blumenthal, and we passed some legislation unanimously here in the Senate. That legislation increases the Department of Veterans Affairs accountability to make certain that senior VA executives and certain healthcare employees convicted of a felony do not receive the same benefits as those who diligently and honorably serve our nation's veterans. Not as an aside, but as a separate sentence, let me take this moment to say thank you to those people within the Department of Veterans Affairs who conscientiously care for and fulfill their responsibilities to our nation's veterans each and every day, and how saddening it must be that they have to work side by side with people who commit crimes and other failures to our veterans and receive no consequence for that behavior. We want to protect our veterans. We also want to make certain that those who work at the Department of Veterans Affairs know that their profession is honorable and that they are doing the right thing. Difficult to reach that conclusion when surrounded by individuals who have not fulfilled that responsibility. In light of the situation with Mr. Wisner and other cases of wrongdoing, so awful that they've been found guilty of a felony, we will not tolerate crimes against veterans that cause harm to their personal safety or are involved in corrupt and backroom dealings with senior VA executives. That legislation passed the United States Senate on the final day of our session last year. It passed unanimously. Unfortunately, that legislation did not then pass the House of Representatives, despite what we were told was significant support for it. It just didn't work in the schedule. So today I'm back on the Senate floor. A hotline request is pending in which I ask that legislation unanimously passed by the United States Senate in the final day of the previous session would pass today. That will then give the House of Representatives time, the mechanics, to see that this legislation becomes law. And in fact, the very first piece of legislation I introduced in this session, the 115th, was increasing the Department of Veterans Affairs Accountability to Veterans Act of 2017. We today call for its swift passage. I'm hopeful that this legislation will provide an ounce of justice to those victims who have suffered at the hands of this VA employee. And I call on my colleagues to once again stand with me in passing this legislation. In addition to the issues of accountability of wrongdoing employees of the department, this legislation also has additional provisions, and those provisions include holding VA leaders accountable for department mismanagement, hiring well-qualified people and addressing employee performance, preventing employees from conflicts of interest, and improving manager training. We have a duty. Who of all people in this country should we pay respect and honor to? Who should we care for? Who should we make certain we live up to the commitments that were made? One would think that those who served in our military, who protected our freedoms and liberties, were the ones that we would put on that high pedestal and make sure that everything possible to protect them was done. We have a duty to the taxpayers as well to make sure that funds are not going to employees who are convicted of crimes against those veterans that they are charged to protect and to serve. There have been a number of VA scandals, corruption and illegal activity in nearly every state. Whether it's been a secret wait list in a hospital that delayed critical care, opioid over-medication that led to the death or suicide or physical abuse and neglect, crimes must come to an end, and there must be accountability for us to be able to say we're doing everything possible to bring those crimes to an end. This legislation is an important step in making the VA worthy of the service of those who have sacrificed for this nation. Given the previous unanimous support, I can't imagine, I hope there is no reason why this legislation should not again pass today. And I call upon my colleagues in the United States Senate to stand with me and Senator Blumenthal and others as we work to make certain that the VA is a department that's worthy of the veterans it serves. Mr. President, I yield the floor, but before I do so, I note the absence of a quorum.